Greetings, welcome to Chapter 2. I am not a chemist, but we do have to learn about chemistry because, surprisingly, even though I study the life sciences and I'm a biologist, chemistry is a very huge part of our cellular function, our metabolic activities, and so we have to know just a little bit about chemistry, but it's not going to be super lengthy. So sit tight and hold on. Most of you, or many of you, have been introduced to some basic chemistry. So obviously we know that matter is anything that takes up space and has mass. And we know that elements are those that cannot be broken down further, and they are listed in the periodic table. There are 92 naturally occurring elements, and the living organisms really have 6 elements in common, and we look at those, we remember those by Ch2. So carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and even sulfur. This is the periodic table. Many of you have seen those. It is organized in rows and periods, groups. So basically, the most simplistic idea of basic chemistry is atom level. We talked about atoms when we talked about the biological levels of organization. So the atom is the smallest unit of a pure element. It's very tiny. It's made of subatomic particles. And the ones that we know for now are protons, neutrons, and electrons. This shows you an atom and what it might look like with its nucleus, which you'll find the proton and neutron, and then the electron is found in a shell surrounding the nucleus. Protons are positive, neutrons are negative, and these are very important to determine what type of element that you are looking at, knowing those subatomic particles. Electrons are probably a huge component for subatomic particles because they're negatively charged. They're found in those electron clouds or those orbitals. They weigh virtually nothing. And the electrons are really critical because they are responsible, because they're orbiting around that nucleus, they're responsible for determining how an atom will interact with another atom. So your textbook kind of describes this a little bit more, and I would definitely read about that because the importance of electrons to us for life sciences we see in so many different ways in how metabolic activities happen in our cells and how some of these molecules interact with other molecules. It's hugely important to understand that it's the electron that determines reactivity for a molecule. When we look at the elements, we're looking at each element that is defined by a descriptive letter or atomic symbol, like you're looking at carbon here, and then you can see the atomic number, which is looking at the number of protons, and then the mass number, which is protons and neutrons. When we look at certain molecules or certain elements, we can see that some elements are not so stable. So there are isotopes that have different values, and some of those isotopes are unstable. Molecules, not that they have feelings, but there is an innate need to be stable, and isotopes that are unstable will break down and release radioactivity. We utilize radioactivity for various reasons, like using radioactive elements to target cancers and things like that. When we are focusing on electron activity, remember I said electrons are responsible for reactions. This is hugely important because later we're going to talk about energy and function, and we're going to talk about cell respiration, and we're going to mention electron transport chains, and we're going to talk huge about electron behavior. So electrons are responsible for determining chemical behavior of atoms. They're attracted to a positively charged nucleus, so it requires energy to hold that electron in its shell, and it requires energy to keep it from going outside of that shell. So because of the position in that electron shell that surrounds the nucleus, electrons have this potential energy, and that electron energy gets used in lots of metabolic functions when we talk about our cells. When we look at different elements or molecules, we often use the Bohr model. Electrons are too tiny to really pinpoint, but scientists decided long ago, chemists really, to focus on kind of imagining or giving us an idea of what an electron might look like and how it orbits around that nucleus. So the Bohr model is the most common model of electron mapping. You'll see hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, all of these are modeled using the Bohr model. The octet rule just states that everything is much more stable when the outer shell of that electron shell has 8 electrons. If a valence shell, that outermost shell is referred to as a valence shell, if a valence shell has less than 8 electrons, it's going to get those 8 electrons by taking electrons from other molecules or losing electrons by giving them away. Chemical bonds are super critical to living organisms because these bonds really determine a lot of behaviors of living organisms. There are ionic bonds, so those are formed when two atoms that have different electron numbers or charges bond together, and you'll see this in salt. So it's not the strongest, they dissociate in water. We've seen salt, water, right? Covalent bonds are formed between two similar atoms. So these guys share electrons, not a give or take. So we say handshakes need 2 hands, covalent bonds require 2 electrons. They're very strong and very stable. So nonpolar covalent bonds happen when sharing between atoms is equal. This is not your random toddler behavior. This is older kid behavior where these bonds want to share equally. So polar bonds, electrons are not shared equally, right? When you see electronegativity, that happens when atoms are able to attract the electron more often. So the greater number of protons, the higher the electronegativity. Hydrogen bonds are super critical to life sciences. So it's a weak bond when you have just one single hydrogen bond, but some molecules have more than one hydrogen bond, and then you'll see a much stronger bond when you see that. Water, which is super critical to living organisms, require hydrogen bonding. So you'll see a hydrogen and an oxygen and a hydrogen bonded together with another hydrogen and oxygen and hydrogen. So hydrogen bonds are critical with the H2O. So hydrogen bonds cause water to have very distinct characteristics, and I would know the characteristics of water for a lecture exam. So hydrogen bonds cause water to have a high specific heat, Water has a high heat capacity. It can absorb heat without a huge change in temperature. Water has a high heat of evaporation, so it vaporizes into the atmosphere when boiled. Animals release heat, like by sweating. Water is a huge solvent. It's the universal solvent, in fact. It's very good for dissolving substances. We talk about when ions disperse in water, they move and collide, allowing reactions to happen. Some terms that we talk about, and we talk about it now, we talk about it later too, and we talk about the looking at the cell and things like that. We talk about hydrophilic and hydrophobic. So if something is hydrophilic, it's water loving and it attracts water molecules. If it's hydrophobic, we say water fearing, and these do not attract water molecules. Like something hydrophobic, obviously oil, water fearing, water repellent. Because of the hydrogen bonds, water also has a high surface tension, so it takes a ton of energy to break the surface of water. Water molecules also stick to things and to each other, so that's another really critical trait that water has. So it's cohesive and adhesive. So cohesive, and we'll see this in the lab. I'll talk to you more about the properties of water in lab when you'll see water molecules stick to each other, and then they'll also stick to other polar molecules. This is what is responsible for transport. Like when you see a giant tree, just know water comes from the roots of that giant tree. So it takes evapotranspiration to allow water to go from the root all the way to the top of the canopy of that tree. And that happens as special pores inside the leaves of that tree open up, water evaporates, that draws water up through that vascular system in that plant. And because of the cohesive and adhesive behaviors of water, it actually works very effectively. Another property of water is that frozen water is less dense than liquid. So we know that for sure. We make ourselves glasses of ice water all the time, and we can see that ice floats on top of that water. And that's very important because if you're an organism that lives in a body of water, it's critical that ice forms on top of that water, and that acts as kind of an insulator to those organisms living in cold water. Another component of your chemical chapter 2, is looking at acids and bases. So something is acidic when it releases hydrogen ions, and something is basic if it releases OH ions. So basically, it's acidic or basic. When we look at the acidic or the basic nature of substances, we rate it on a pH scale. So the pH ranges from 0 to 14, and every change in number is actually a 10 times more basic than the previous, if that makes sense. So it's a log scale, really, with 0 being the most acidic, 14 being the most basic, and 7 being neutral. We have buffers in our body to maintain pH in a normal range. It's required because human blood has to be maintained in a very small, slightly basic level.